Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you to the organizers. It's really a privilege to wrap up this incredible series of talks to talk about sex differences in long COVID, an enigmatic, novel condition where there are more questions than answers. So hopefully somebody in the audience has some answers for us today as well. Okay, so again, I'm Linda Geng. So I am a co-director and co-founder of the Stanford Long COVID Collaborative. Sitting here also in the room is Dr. Hector Bonilla from Infectious Diseases. And we have a great privilege of working with a lot of different specialists as well as research collaborators. And I just want to say that I'm representing a lot of the different amazing work that's being done. And so I wanted to give a broad overview of a really emerging field. Disclosures are not relevant to the content today. I just wanted to summarize, since this is a rapidly evolving field, just the significant impact that long COVID has had on society. So an estimated 400 million people globally have been impacted by long COVID. It's the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's estimated that an annual economic impact is approximately $1 trillion. And this is encompassing healthcare burdens from the disability, healthcare costs, as well as lost jobs. It's estimated about 4 million Americans have not been able to work because of long COVID debilitation. And it was estimated as of CDC statistics, although those statistics have stopped recording, but as of about a year and a half ago, 5% of all adult Americans were still experiencing some form of long COVID. So what is long COVID? And the definition has evolved over time, and this is really important because as we look at research studies, if one study defines long COVID as different than another, then we really have heterogeneity in how we interpret the data as well. In June of 2024, the National Academies came together with a large stakeholder group and a really extensive process. The actual NASEM report is over 100 pages, but it comes down to this as of the current definition, which is that long COVID is an infection-associated chronic condition that occurs after SARS-CoV-2 and is present for at least 3 months, and it can be a continuous or relapsing and remitting or progressive disease state that affects one or more organ systems. And this is an NEJ, an accompanying article describing how that definition came to be, and a diagram that graphically demonstrates the complexity of this illness. And there's all these multi-system diagnosable conditions that can fall under this umbrella. And if you look at the left column, common symptoms, there are no exclusionary symptoms. So the list of symptoms can be hundreds long, but there are some common ones that come to the forefront. It is also important that there are, so long COVID isn't an exclusionary condition, meaning it's not a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning you can have one of these diagnosable conditions and long COVID, or that COVID triggered or worsened this pre-existing condition, such as rheumatologic conditions, oncologic conditions, other infectious illnesses. And I wanted to highlight here that it's really important. We were actually just visiting a community clinic, and a pediatrician said, I don't think there's long COVID. I don't think I've seen it in children. And indeed, it can, in fact, affect anybody through the span of the lifespan, from children to adults, regardless of health, disability, socioeconomic status, as well as sex. But we'll talk about, of course, some of the specific differences that we see. And also I wanted to mention too, again, highlighting the heterogeneity, is that the trajectory of long COVID can be highly variable. Some folks can recover within that 3 to 6 month period of time, and others go on to experience debilitating illness for years and currently potentially lifelong. So I mentioned anyone can have this, but one thing that is consistently coming to the forefront in the literature over and over, and this is a list of, this is from a meta-analysis of different studies now, and that column and table here shows the different studies, and that it's pretty consistent. Over and over again, there's about a 1.5 to 2 times higher odds of long COVID occurring females versus males. And the differential risk seems to also be highest for the age group of 40 to 54, which I'll loop back to later as well. And there's what's described as a paradox, but in contrast to acute COVID-19, where males experience more severe disease and typically higher rates of mortality from the acute illness. whereas females tend to have a higher risk of developing chronic illness post-COVID. And so how does long COVID manifest? I mentioned briefly some of the common symptoms, and how does this differ in males and females? So we're part of an NIH national consortium called the NIH Recover Initiative. Across the country, we have enrolled over the years almost 14,000 adults in the adult cohort. There's also a pediatric as well as a pregnancy cohort. And within this cohort, we're trying to distinguish, because there are hundreds of symptoms that can be associated with long COVID, what are the symptoms that are most distinguishing for individuals who are likely to have long COVID compared to those who likely don't have long COVID. There's no gold standard diagnostic test nor diagnostic criteria. And so what we compared were those with and without infection to understand a base rate of these symptoms in the general population, or a population of people without SARS-CoV-2 infection. Of course, that does change over the years because more and more of the population had then gotten infected with SARS-CoV-2. But from this analysis with almost 14,000 participants, we did find a series of symptoms listed here in this table that were typically the most distinguishing for long COVID. And that includes loss of taste and smell, as well as something called post-exertional malaise, which is the phenomenon where patients feel like they're crashing or feeling worse, or malaise, like a flu-like illness, or worsening of their symptoms after exertion. And that can be physical, mental, cognitive, or social emotional. And then other symptoms here also include cognitive issues, palpitations, cardiovascular symptoms, or respiratory symptoms. Oh, excuse me. So when we look at this further from the Recover Initiative, we do see that long COVID symptoms can also differ. So the frequency of some of these symptoms can also differ among females compared to the males group. And so, for example, boxed in red here, there are some symptoms that stand out for higher frequency. For example, palpitations, sickness from triggers, gastrointestinal symptoms, hair loss, compared to some of the symptoms like sleep apnea or chronic cough that tended to occur more frequently in the males who had long COVID, as designated by a research index that we developed through the Recover Initiative. And there was an interesting preprint that came out from Dr. Akiko Iwasaki's group at Yale, who also has done a lot of work in long COVID. And their diagram, I thought, was a really beautiful depiction of some of the similar findings we found in the Recover Initiative, where red describes the symptoms that are male predominant, and then the blue are the female predominant symptoms. And you can see that the distribution for those that are more frequent versus less frequent in that graph on the right differ between the sexes. And then furthermore, what they found was in the graph on the top left is that females with long COVID tend to overall have a higher symptom burden, meaning the total number of symptoms that one might have. And this is important because what we do see clinically is that those who tend to be more debilitated, have lower function, end up not being able to work and have a disability, are those who tend to have a dozen or more symptoms across different organ systems and domains. Long COVID really is, and if you start to look at the specific symptoms that people can experience, it really is a syndrome of syndromes. So this is an umbrella term. It's not just one thing. And so it becomes really, really complex as we try to tease apart the different subtypes of long COVID. But I tried to diagram here some of the categorizations. So for example, post-COVID, you can have the sequelae that you had experienced during the acute infection. For example, you could have had pulmonary fibrosis after really severe ARDS, or stroke from a clotting event, etc. So there are different things that can occur for direct organ damage that occurred during the acute phase that has now persisted or had sequelae and lingered into the chronic phase. There's also other syndromes that are hospitalization or ICU complications that also have symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, and some of the other issues that are under this umbrella of long COVID, but have been previously defined as, for example, post-intensive care syndrome that are already well recognized. There may be treatment-related effects, and there may be other known autoimmune conditions that have been previously known for other viral infections as well that can occur after post-COVID. And then there are these other syndromes and other occurrences that can occur under this umbrella of long COVID. And some of those, as we think about fatigue and brain fog and pain and autonomic dysfunction, as well as post-exertional malaise, these are symptoms that overlap with some of the other known syndromes that have been poorly understood in the history of medicine and more recently come to limelight in research and biomedical investigation. And that includes things like fibromyalgia for myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, or MECFS, POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Many patients after COVID have issues with their autonomic nervous system, and this is one of those syndromes that can occur. So we see this clinical observation of phenotypic differences between males and females, as well as the risk of developing long COVID in general, because the differential risk, especially in the Middle Ages, for females versus males. And so the question is, why is it that females have this higher rate of long COVID compared to males? And this is where it's really emerging. I mean, the research is rapidly evolving, and there are models and hypotheses that are being proposed through the field. But again, this is reflecting something that is very nascent, and your input on this and ideas are very, very welcome. But some of the things that have been proposed, and I'll highlight some of the research that has been done both here at Stanford as well as elsewhere to highlight some of these. And that includes, for example, immunological differences, which have been discussed for other conditions during this series of talks. That includes the potential that for females, there's a stronger protective in the acute phase immune response, and especially adaptive, and therefore there's lower mortality and more protective effect in the acute setting. But then if this doesn't turn off properly, or if autoimmunity develops, then you have chronic issues that linger in the long term, although you were protected in the short term. And secondly, of course, this interacts with the immune system and has downstream effects on the immunity, are genetic factors. For example, the X chromosome and X inactivation and the link there with autoimmunity and other factors as well. And then thirdly, hormonal influences may be at play here as well, particularly as we think about the age group that shows the most disparity in the risk factor for risk development for long COVID in males versus females. Around the perimenopausal age to menopausal age. Again, when you look at age group 18 to 39, that differential rate of development of long COVID between females and males isn't that different. But then as you progress in age, it seems to have a higher difference, and then it goes down a little bit again postmenopausally. And there's hypothesis that estrogen and or testosterone may be driving this. Okay, and I'm going to run through these a little bit quicker because I think I am running low on time, but we can discuss this in detail in Q&A as well. So this was actually a really nice study run by Dr. Catherine Blish here at Stanford, and this was a small study comparing in different time points males and females who had either recovered from acute COVID or had developed long COVID. And what was interestingly found here is that females who developed long COVID had reduced TGF beta-1 expression during acute infection, whereas males who developed long COVID compared to males who recovered had increased TGF beta signaling during acute infection. So there seems to be differential signatures in the immune pathway and cytokine pathways in the acute setting that tend to predict who gets long COVID. Additionally, it was also found that in the acute setting, there seemed to be differential expression of the exist non-coding RNA, which again plays a role in X chromosome inactivation, has been linked to autoimmunity as well. So this dysregulation may be a contributing factor to some of the downstream proposed immune dysregulation. And then going back to Dr. Iwasaki's group, they looked at that cohort of, they looked at about 165 participants, including controls who had recovered or healthy controls versus those who developed long COVID in males and females. And what was interesting in their study, they looked at a whole bunch of different hormones and signals, and what came out most dominantly was that females with long COVID had significantly lower testosterone levels than control females, those who either recovered or did not develop long COVID at all. And so what was interesting is the flip side, which is that they found that males with long COVID had significantly lower estradiol levels than control males. So again, there's something interesting here about the non-dominant sex hormone in the different sexes and their association with development of long COVID. Okay, and finally, another study from the Stanford group with Dr. Mark Davis, who spoke earlier as well. And this was interesting because it looked at not only samples from our long COVID patient population, but also the other syndrome that's a post-viral syndrome called MACFS, which has similar symptoms, for example, post-exertional malaise, fatigue, a really debilitating, for example, brain fog and other symptoms, multi-system. And here, looking at peripheral blood lymphocytes, what was found in summary is that the redox pathway seems to be altered in both the ME/CFS donors as well as the long COVID donors, and with elevated oxidative stress as an overall finding. However, when you look at sex-specific findings, in both the ME/CFS and the long COVID groups, there was in females a higher total reactive oxygen species and elevated mitochondrial calcium levels. In males, in both the syndromes, there was a total ROS level that was normal, but higher lipid oxidative damage. This suggests that there are some differences in how these redox pathways may be dysregulated in males versus females. But I think it's really fascinating that this was found in both long COVID samples as well as ME/CFS. Again, it kind of speaks to the fact that when we think about these infection-associated chronic conditions or these post-viral syndromes, there may be shared biological pathways that may be dysregulated. Okay, and so in summary, what we find is that, and this is consistent, that female sex is a robust, independent risk factor for long COVID. And there's the greatest disparity in the midlife, although I think somebody, the prior talk brought up great points that this may not just be biological, but there may also be other factors. For example, like I mentioned, long COVID doesn't have a diagnostic, a confirmatory biomarker or test. It's not a diagnosis of exclusion, so during this perimenopausal period, a lot of perimenopausal symptoms may also overlap with long COVID. There could be concurrent conditions happening here as well. As well as long COVID symptom patterns and burden differ between the sexes. And we see this clinically as well. And from the highlight of some of the studies that I showed, emerging mechanistic studies and biomarker studies suggest that there are sex-specific biological pathways, possibly immune, genetic, hormonal, and mitochondrial, that contribute to these sex differences in long COVID. And then finally, taking the forest view and taking further steps back, we think about how long COVID is both a novel condition, but also in a way it's been around for a long time, because virally mediated chronic illness, it has existed before COVID-19 existed. And so whether it's ME/CFS or post long flu or EBV fatigue, mono fatigue, we may be able to shed light in a broader way across post-viral syndromes and learn from other infection-associated chronic conditions too to understand long COVID. And finally, this is just taking that bird's eye view as well. I wanted to bring up that there are so many other infectious agents, especially viruses, but also bacteria and parasites that can lead to infection-associated chronic conditions. So this is really an umbrella within an umbrella. And then furthermore, another umbrella that I'd like to point out, and the reason is because many of these complex syndromes on the right umbrella tend to have predilection in female populations. So just something to think about, again, that ties together some of these complex illnesses and some of these infection-associated chronic conditions, whether it's immunological, hormonal, and or genetic, could they be linking some of these pathophysiological pathways together? And finally, with that, I'd just like to acknowledge, of course, the collaborative and all of our multidisciplinary clinical and staff and research collaborators, the NIH Recover initiative that is currently also undergoing, as Dr. Utz knows, and has led a lot of those committees, the multi-omics and a lot of the analyses now that are underway to look at our entire cohort and hopefully shed more light on this very puzzling condition. So thank you.